This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today, a little something different for you, my loyal audience. It might sound different when you first hear what I'm going to say today, but it's not really different. It's in the same headspace that I always stay on all of my podcast episodes. My guest today is Frank Ostaseski. He's dedicated his life to service. He's the co-founder of the Zen Hospice Project and the founder of the Metta Institute. He's a Buddhist teacher, international lecturer, and a leading voice in contemplative end-of-life care. Basically, and Frank might kill me for saying it like this, but Frank is an expert in dying. Well, let me say it a better way. Frank is an expert in taking the experience of dying, experiencing that firsthand in a way that almost none of us, unless we are medical caregivers, can understand. But Frank has taken that experience, the death experience, being there with people when they pass, and taken it a step back so all of us can learn. What can we learn from the death experience? Because, hey, no matter what we talk about in terms of politics or this or that or our callings in life, death, at least until the Donald Hoffmans of the world and the Robin Hansons of the world figure out how to scan our minds and put it on a hard drive, at least until we get to that point, the common thing that binds us all together, birth and death. Today, Frank and I will discuss his book, The 5 Invitations, which I implore you to read. It's something different, but it's something the same. It's a different perspective, but it's the perspective you already have in you. The 5 invitations sound quite simple, but they're not. Don't wait. Welcome everything. Push away nothing. Bring your whole self to the experience. Find a place of rest in the middle of things. And my favorite, cultivate don't know mind. What a great expression. Don't know mind. Before you even hear this interview, now you know why it's in the same headspace with all of my work. Don't know mind. If you have a don't know mind, you are already on the path to a great life. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Frank Ostaseski. So Frank, I want you to place me at a time, a physical location, your introduction to Buddhism. When did that happen for you?
Oh boy, Michael, I think it happened when I was quite young, probably 19 or 20 years old. The real depth or jumping into the deeper waters of Buddhism happened during a one-year stay in Southeast Asia, India, Sri Lanka, Nepal, that part of the world. You know, it just made so much sense to me. It didn't ask me to believe anything, but it did ask me to trust my own direct experience.
And that kind of is someone who's far less experienced and read and taught on the subject as you. But that's my feeling, is that it's just, there's not the judgment that I would see in other faiths. And maybe some people might disagree with that statement, but I feel like it is just, it starts with be a good person, lead a good life, do the right thing. And if you can stay there, a lot of good stuff happens.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, I think it depends on who you're talking to and what their introduction to Buddhism is. In the States, Of course, it's gotten really woven in with psychology, and so there's a kind of warm feeling to it. But there's fundamentalist Buddhists, just like there are fundamentalists in every kind of tradition across the world. But in general, the focus of Buddhist practice is, how do you be happy? How do you be happy? How do you reduce suffering in your life? And how do you cultivate happiness? So you have this quality of restraint and cultivation. They go together. For some, as I say, it's a strongly held religion. It's a cultural practice as well. And for others, it's more of a philosophy of being. So I think it's held in many different ways across the world.
Yeah, some of those things you're saying there, though, we can really dive deep on. I mean, happiness. Happiness is so easy. It's so easy to find happiness. My gosh, it's like the hardest thing for people to find in the modern world, isn't it?
Well, I think it has to do with how we try to find happiness. We're often looking for the conditions of our life to produce happiness, the right relationship, the right car, the right job, etc. The challenge, of course, is that all of those conditions are subject to change. They're all going to move. They're going to come, they're going to go. And if we place the totality of our happiness is based on those conditions, we're inevitably going to be disappointed.
Those conditions are fleeting.
Like everything else.
Like us, we're fleeting.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. It's really funny. When we talk about it with people, I say, seasons come and go, relationships come and go. Everything is always emerging and falling away. And everybody agrees with that pretty much, except me. In other words, everything is changing except me. I'm the one solid thing in a changing universe, yeah? And that's part of our challenge, I think. And it's also one of the things that causes us some degree of loneliness and despair, and is this sense of separation that we often have when we pull ourselves out of the stream of constant change.
When I was going through your work, your book, you just raise and bring up the points and questions that are the most important issues. But in our modern world, inundated with social media and cable news stations, they're the subjects that no one talks about.
Facts are facts. Everyone's going to die sooner or later. And no magic tricks and no spiritual gimmickry or even medical intervention is going to keep that from happening. It will ultimately happen. Instead of denying its reality and arguing with it, what happens if we attune ourselves with it? And, we don't even have to look at death so much. We could just look at the way we meet endings. The end of an exhale, the end of a day, the end of a meal, the end of this sentence. How do you meet endings in life? Do you go unconscious around them, or do you leave either emotionally or mentally before an event, for example, is over? So one of the ways that I think we can understand something about our relationship to death is, what's our relationship to endings? Does it cause us anxiety? Are we indifferent about it? Do we isolate ourselves and withdraw, and pull into some kind of protective cocoon? How do you meet endings? When you leave a party, do you ghost out of the party, or do you say goodbye to people? I think the way in which we meet endings forms a habit, and habits have a very strong momentum. And that momentum carries through even until the time of our dying.
Let's stick with that idea, though, on the endings for a moment, and how we deal with endings. I love the point you just made about leaving a party. Maybe someone might hear that thought. They might think, well, that's not such a big deal, one way or the other. But I think your point for the careful listener is already like, hold on. Why would you sneak out of the party instead of saying the goodbyes? And I'm guilty of these sneaks occasionally. But why would you sneak out instead of saying goodbye? Because if you are sneaking out, you're kind of dealing in a very odd way with an ending, because it might be the end right there. Like, why are you not fully embracing all those people in that moment? Because that might be the last moment.
It could be. And, I don't have a moral judgment on how people are supposed to leave parties or how they're supposed to meet endings for that matter. But, we can look and we can see what our habits are there. I have a friend of mine, for example. She was at a party recently, and she turned to the person she was with and said, okay, let's go. And he said, fine. And he turned to the person next to him and shook his hand and said, gee, I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to talk. I have to go now. I hope we can see each other another time and perhaps have a conversation. And then he went to the next person in the room and said goodbye to them and said, it was great to be with you. I loved it, and really enjoyed myself. And he went around the entire room saying goodbye to all the people. And it was a relatively small party, so he said goodbye to everyone in the room. And meanwhile, my friend was there, and she realized that she didn't do it that way at all, that she just kind of sneaks out the door. And part of it is, she said, I didn't think anybody noticed that I arrived. So I didn't think they'd miss me when I left. So I think the way in which we meet endings can say something to us about our life and how do we engage with it? What's the nature of our relationships? Death is not something waiting for us at the end of a long road or just at the end of a long-term illness or some such thing. It's with us all the time. It's in the marrow of every experience. It's right here, right now. I would add to this that the way in which we meet endings tends to shape the way the next thing begins. T.S. Eliot said that. He said, "In my end is my beginning." It behooves us to really pay attention. How do we meet the endings? And what does that set in place for the way the next thing begins?
I want to share an example with you, a quick story, and then I want to let you also add some other examples throughout this conversation, because I think you've got some great experiences that not many of us could even probably imagine. I mean, you've gone down an interesting path for sure. So my grandmother died about a year ago. She reached about 100.5, so she got to about 106 months.
Wow.
Her mother lived to 101. And the funny thing was, though, is that, she really was kind of getting tired and kind of out of it the last, from 98, 99. And she would say, "Hey, I miss my husband. I miss my friends," because she's outlived everybody. But what she was doing, though, and she kind of said this after she got to 100, or we kind of figured it out. She wanted to get to 100 because she thought the family would like it, that the family would think it was kind of cool. But once she got to 100, she was telling people, "Once I get to 100, put the black on because I'm leaving." And she was kind of very, very upfront about it. Essentially, she really did. Once she got past 100, she really decided, okay, that's it. I want to go see whatever she imagined she was going to see, but she wanted to move on. And she essentially stopped eating. And, I guess it's a little sad, but I think it was one of those situations where I don't know how she felt exactly, but I think for the family, we kind of felt like, she did it her way. I don't think anyone really felt sad about that. I mean, kind of like, oh, wow, she did it her way. She had this milestone in her head late in life. And then once she got it, she was like, okay, I'm missing my friends and family.
That's a beautiful story. That's a really great illustration. I mean, I think it happens as we age sometimes. Well, first of all, we've all been influenced about dying by what we've been told, by our families, the way we were raised by our family, by our cultural biases. If we've been raised in some religion, there's probably some religious conditioning that goes into that. So we all have stories already about dying. And I think those things shape the way in which we die. They have an effect on us. In the case of your grandma, it's beautiful what you say, that in a sense, she had this goal. She really wanted to get there, and that's a common experience. People say, if I just can live to Christmas, I just want to be here until Christmas. I want to see my granddaughter born or some such thing. And people amazingly can sort of continue. But also, it's beautiful what you said about she's outlived her peer group. And it's frequently the case, if you go to a nursing home, for example, you'll see people sort of staring out the window. And in a way, it looks a little sad. And maybe you might think that they're depressed or blank. It's just that more of their relationships are on the other side, so to speak. They have more relationships with people who have died, in a way. We're here saying, let's play bingo, and Parcheesi or something, They don't have so much interest in this. They're in a different realm. Like when I'm dying, maybe it's true for you. I want mastery. I want somebody around me who really knows what they're doing. I want my pain to be well attended to, well controlled. I want my symptoms to be well managed. But mastery is not going to be enough. I want somebody with me who can also is familiar with the territory of meaning and can help me figure out, or at least explore with me, what the purpose and value of this life has been, and even what it is that I'm in the midst of. But then there's a juncture in the dying process where meaning falls away. And we're still talking to Grandma about, her trip to Antarctica or how much she liked to ride the roller coaster at Coney Island. And Grandma's in a new place. Grandma's in this other territory. We could call it the territory of mystery, for lack of a better term. And this is the territory where we're all explorers. We're all adventurers. This is the land of unanswerable questions. And the best we can do in this territory is not to impose our beliefs or, try and answer the questions, but bear witness. Stay with people. See what they're discovering. Let them be the guide in that territory of mystery. And I think that this is a wholesome way, if you will, to look at this process. We need all three of those things. We need mastery. We need somebody comfortable in the territory of meaning. And also, we got open to mystery.
As you were describing and talking some about the nursing home experience, I was thinking about, okay, the last time I was in her facility, you just kind of forced me to think about that experience differently. And of course, when you're in an assisted care facility, you're going to see people, if they are older, physically, they're going to be going down. And so that's usually what you notice first. And perhaps you feel, individually, you might feel some sorrow or gosh, they look bad, or they don't look healthy, or maybe they don't even have a smile on their face. I'm kind of inferring from one thing you said that gets us all thinking, which is the looking out the window, that individual that might be looking on the downside of their physical body, who might just be staring out the window, inside their mind, unless we know, they could be having a very nice time inside their mind and we don't know.
Exactly. And that's why I think it's really important that we engage them, and not try and tell them what their experience should be, but find out, if they can. And sometimes people have difficulty with speech, they have aphasia or some other issues, but you can find out an awful lot about people without using spoken words, spoken language. I think that we so identify with our bodies that it's very hard for us to imagine, particularly at a younger age, we identify with our bodies. It's very hard to imagine that someone could actually relax that identification. It's not that they don't have it anymore. It's just more relaxed. It's not all that they are. You know that as we all mature, right? When we were teenagers, it was all about the body and our neuroses. And then, as we aged a little bit, we got a little more mature. We began to see that we were more well-rounded than that. We had, more to offer the world, more, we could take in more from the world. When we get to a ripe old age, like your grandma, maybe it's not so much about the body. Maybe it's about their heart, or maybe it's about some kind of inquiry into the mystery of life. And it's not always about having fixed answers. It's often much more about questions than answers. That's actually a really nice way to live. And it's a really, in my experience anyway, it's a beautiful way to be around people. It's really honest.
That's really the direction of your work, is how can we take that experience of dying and then apply it to our lives? Before we go that direction, though, I want you to give the audience some perspective, because we talk about the issue of dying and everyone wants to know what people's experiences are. You helped founder of something many years ago called the Zen Hospice Project, the first Buddhist hospice in the States. I would like to, not in a kind of gratuitous type way or a focus on numbers, but Frank, you've had a lot of experience, I'm guessing, with people dying in your arms.
I've had the great good fortune of being with people in these really vulnerable times, And while many of us, or many people listening, might imagine that's morbid, it was anything but that. It was incredibly tender, oftentimes fierce, but it was real. And I've probably been with a couple of thousand people as they've died over the course of, several decades.
Except for doctors, there's not many people around the world that could probably say that.
Nurses
and doctors.
And frontline folks, home health aides, nurses, assistants, those are the ones who are often there at the time of dying. Doctors are not often there at the time of dying. It's often a paraprofessional, sometimes the janitor who's cleaning the room. And I would add to that when we think about healthcare in the United States, at least, and now we're in the midst of debates around healthcare reform, et cetera, the real healthcare that's being provided is really being provided by families and friends. Most of the care that's happening is really happening by untrained people. Families, family members, friends, they're doing the lion's share of the work.
That's not necessarily bad, though, is it?
I don't think it's bad at all, but I think that sometimes we live under the illusion that that the healthcare is there to do everything for us. The healthcare system is there to do everything for us. And in point of fact, there's challenges with that, of course. I think, coming back to your question, yes, it's incredibly real to be with people at the end of life. And sometimes people make these unbelievable reconciliations. I work with a lot of folks who lived on the streets of San Francisco in terrible conditions, in rat-infested hotels, in awful conditions. What I found frequently was that these people met these unbearable conditions with tremendous resource that somehow emerged for them in around the time of their dying. Here's an example. I work with a hemophiliac man who contracted the HIV disease from a blood transfusion. The year before, he had disowned his gay son because he had AIDS. Now, father and son are in twin beds in the same bedroom, being cared for by Agnes, the son's mother and the father's wife. Oftentimes, people in these situations, they made unbelievable reconciliations with families and friends and found forgiveness they'd been looking for their whole lives. But sometimes, honestly, they turned toward the wall in withdrawal and depression, and they never came back again. All of them were my teachers, every one of them. And they invited me into these incredibly vulnerable moments in their lives. And they showed me what really mattered, and they taught me how to live.
Was there a start, though, for you? So, for example, to put yourself in a position, and I just think most people listening are probably thinking, my gosh, Frank is a saint, because most people listening have not been on the streets of San Francisco helping people that are dying. Okay, that's just the numbers of my listeners on probably any podcast show, even if you're on Tim Ferriss's show, the numbers of people that have gone through that are limited. What was driving you? How did you go down the path to open up that door for the first time to find yourself there as a healthy, able-bodied person, to find yourself in that position to where you would go down that path? What opened up for you? What was the door?
Great question. Really good question. And such questions are hard to answer, actually, because they're not linear, right? I mean, how did you come to do what you do? You probably did a bunch of things and, went around in circles a few times and wound up doing something you really loved. And I think the same was true for me. In my own case, my own parents died when I was quite young. My mom when I was about 16 and my dad just a few years later. And so I was introduced to death very early on in my life. Later, as we talked earlier, I discovered Buddhist practice, and the central tenet of Buddhist practice, if you will, is the study of impermanence, the study of constant change. And so I got really familiar with it. I went to, when my son was born, this is a funny story. Well, for me, it's funny anyway. We were hippies. His mom was giving birth to him at home, right, with me and a couple of midwives. She was going to birth his body, and I sort of felt like it was important that I birth his soul. And so I went down to study with Kubler-Ross. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was the pioneer in all this work. We all owe it to her. And I went to this program with her, and everybody in the program in those days was dying or grieving a traumatic loss. And you went around the room and introduced yourself. There weren't many people, maybe 25. And when it came my turn, I said, well, I'm going to have a child in a few weeks, and I want to know how to get his soul into his body, And I said, how can I help with that? I said, you seem to get souls out. Maybe you can help me get his in. Well, in truth, she wasn't very helpful in that regard, but she did invite me back to sort of apprentice with her. And so I went a lot with her to really watch her work with people who were dying and also people who were grieving. That was another big influence in my life. And then we went on a holiday to Mexico and Central America. And there was a flood of refugees leaving Central America into Mexico. And we got involved, gave some money, gave some food. Next thing you know, we were working in the camps, helping people to adjust to, a really difficult life. And in those camps, I saw a lot of horrible dying. I came back to San Francisco and the AIDS epidemic was just beginning. We didn't know what we were dealing with. Well, we had friends who were dying, and in those days, they died in a few days. And so we jumped in to help. And then it made sense to do something more than take care of a few people. And we started the Zen Hospice Project. And basically we didn't have a big plan for it. We just thought there was a natural match between people who were cultivating what we might call the listening mind, or listening heart and meditation, and people who needed to be heard at least once in their life, folks who were dying. And in our case, mostly they were folks who were living on the streets of San Francisco. We didn't just deal with those folks who lived on the streets, but that was a lot of our clients at the very beginning, We also dealt with the elite of San Francisco and cops and firemen and nurses and doctors who were taking care of people with similar illnesses. I think I just kept getting pulled in. And part of what pulled me in, actually, Michael, was how honest it was. It was so real. There was no room for nonsense when you're coming to the end of your life. And that was good to be around. It was really good to be around, especially as a younger man. It was great to be around.
We're all chasing that. We're all chasing the elimination of nonsense if we can find it. There are so many people, though, that perhaps have not yet reached the point where they understand how important that is to eliminate the nonsense. So it's so interesting in life, as I'm in my late 40s, to look at people on various stages where you can kind of feel their clearness in their thinking, whereas maybe I find some younger people, especially in this day of social media, where the mind waters are so much more muddied. And I love, having done this podcast for years now, if I could talk to probably, I think some of my favorite guests have been over 80 years of age for sure. You just find there's a clarity, an economy of words, a focus, and it's just more interesting to listen to those experiences without the mud and the water.
Well, I think that's part of the maturing process, and we kind of bump up against ourselves until we become a little bit wiser and more compassionate. But the thing about dying is that it's inevitable and intimate. These people I'm talking about, people who had what we would call triple diagnosis, which meant they had a life-threatening illness, often some kind of addiction, and often some kind of mental health issue. These are the folks you walk by on the streets, of metropolitan cities all across the world. What I found was these very ordinary people entered into a process in which they developed, we'll say, or discovered really profound insights about their life, about the process of transformation. And they emerged as someone bigger than the small, separate self they've taken themselves to be. Now, I'm not romantic about dying. This is the hardest work we will ever do. And some would say, I think, well, that's great that people have those insights, but that's a little late in your life, in the final days or sometimes moments of your life. But here's the thing. If it exists then, if that possibility exists then, it exists now. And we don't have to wait till the time of our dying to discover the wisdom it has to offer us. And that's why I wrote the book.
I was going to say, that's one of your first invitation is don't wait.
Yeah, I hope not. Let's step into life with both feet. Waiting is full of expectation, waiting for the next moment to arrive. We miss this one. Waiting for the moment of dying. I can't tell you how many times I've been family members who've said, when is mom going to die? And waiting for that moment, they miss all the moments in between. It's not that we should, live our life in a panic or in some kind of unnecessary urgency. I think it's just when it's an encouragement for us to step into our life, really embracing the truth, as we've been talking about here, that inevitably things change. And why would we want to waste our life on meaningless activities? When we get it, just how precarious life can be, then we also appreciate how precious it is. And then we want to step into it fully and completely. We want to live our lives in a responsible way. We want to be grateful for what we have. We want to say, I love you more often, to the people that we care about. We appreciate that human connection is the most important thing.
That lack of human connection today, though, or the direction that we've gone, there is a growing lack of human connection. I wonder if all these great devices that we all have access to are also isolating us.
Well, I think that's certainly a possibility. And in some cases, certainly that's the case. But look at us. Here we are, right? We're doing this podcast now.
It's a tool and we're using it the right way.
Yeah, well, I hope so. I hope it's of some value to the people who are listening. We're having a real conversation. We're having a long-form conversation also, which is pretty rare these days, to really take one subject and jump into it and swim in the deeper waters of it.
The first invite of don't wait, though. It's one of those things you could be going through your life and maybe you hear the expression, don't wait. And maybe you kind of think about it for a second. But then when I sit down and I go through your book and then you read it in that context, and then it kind of just hits you in the head with a 2x4 saying, hold on, what am I doing? Why am I waiting for anything?
Yeah. I think I say somewhere in the book, I forget, but suppose we stop compartmentalizing death. Suppose we stop treating it like it was the bad guy, first of all, the enemy, and we recognized it was a natural part of our lives. I wonder if we might turn to it in a way and say, well, then how should we live? In the light of dying, how should we live? What makes sense? What's most important?
That's a really great question, too, because I think that for those, if you say, okay, gosh, we've got this limited time, it's the same for everybody. We don't know what the time is going to be exactly. So how do we best use that time? Boy, that sure really opens up the door to education and reading and trying to understand the experiences of others before us. Because since we know we've got limited time, we better try to build off those that came before us.
Yeah, I think that's wise thinking. I think that what we do in this culture is we say, well, death is going to happen later. And I think later gives us that comfortable buffer, between now and some other time when we can sort of spin our wheels. It doesn't have to just be about death. What we can do is see the reality of constant change. What we've been talking about here, that we rely on impermanence. the cold you have today won't last forever. That really boring dinner party you're going to go to on Saturday night will come to an end. Without impermanence, your kids wouldn't grow up and take their first steps, and your daughter wouldn't go to the prom. Living in harmony, we could say, or in attunement is a better word, with this confluence of constant change, I think is a way that we live more in a more relaxed way, actually, because it's the truth of what's happening. Instead of living in some kind of denial of it, we step into it and say, okay, all right, now what?
Yeah, your second invitation really opens up the door for even more self-discovery there. Welcome everything, push nothing away. Well, of course, welcome everything. That sounds great. Push nothing away. Well, of course, but hold on. We want to push the bad stuff away. We don't want to have any of those rough experiences, but it's all of the experiences that have to come in, and it all makes a difference. It all helps us grow.
The invitation is welcome everything, push away nothing. Now, that you say, that sounds really good. It'd make a great bumper sticker, but how do we do it? I think the word welcome, and I used it specifically because I think it confronts us to temporarily suspend our usual rush to judgment and simply be open to what's happening. What's actually here.
What's happening right now in the moment of now.
Exactly. And we don't have to like it. And we don't have to agree with it. We don't have to like everything that comes. It's not about becoming Pollyanna or turning ourselves into a doormat. That's not what we're doing. It's an invitation to be receptive, to open ourselves. And in so doing, I think we have more options. We can discover and we can investigate and we can learn how to respond skillfully to anything that we encounter. But if we're not willing to allow it on our front door, it's kind of chasing us down. The great African-American writer, James Baldwin, said something beautiful. He said, there are a lot of things in life that we must face that we cannot change, but nothing can be changed unless we're willing to face it. And that's a way of thinking about welcome everything, I want to meet what's at my door and see what I can learn from it.
For me, as I think about the times in my life where I've gotten through that or I've gained some knowledge, I often find that travel has been such a great, for a modern phrase, a great hack to get me to welcome everything, and that you put yourself in that situation of a country you've never experienced, a language you've never experienced, a culture, and then you jump into the middle of it. Sometimes you can't even write down what it's doing to you.
Absolutely. Travel is, as you say, a really great hack. When we're traveling, we're in a country, let's say we're in a country where we don't speak the language. All our senses are awake, right? And we see more, we smell more, we listen more, we taste more. There's a kind of openness. And openness doesn't reject or get attached to any particular experience or view. It's just spacious and undefended, and it's a kind of non-biased allowing, we could say. And that's what happens. That's one of the things that happens for us in the travel experience, I think, that part of what makes it so enlivening, right? Also, for some people, a little frightening. So welcoming everything, pushing away nothing is actually the opposite of rejecting. Denial breeds ignorance and fear. Ignorance is the support, if you will, the foundation on which suffering rests. If we stay ignorant, and I don't just mean we don't know the facts. Ignorance is not knowing. Ignorance is that we know something, but it's the wrong thing. We've misperceived things, and then we insist on it. That's what ignorance is.
You see that the modern world is filled with that.
Yeah, we only have to look at what's happening in our political climate to see that that's what's going on, not just in the United States, but all over the world.
Why don't I let you take a step back before I bring up the third one and let people know how you came up with this idea? Kind of very clever, and I think you were going to speak in an event. I've spoken at events before, and so I really appreciated the fact of how you did it. And sometimes people think there's this perfection of this speech on a teleprompter, and people don't necessarily think of how inspiration comes, and it just happens. And when it happens, you have to be awake to take it and then use it.
Yeah, beautiful. That's a really great way wouldn't that be a great way to live our lives? Not only give a way of giving talks or speeches, but what a great way to live our lives, right? Really trusting in the intuition that emerges in a given moment. Yeah, I was invited by Bill Moyers, who's a well-known journalist and documentary filmmaker, made lots of shows for NPR in the United States. and PBS. And anyway, he was doing a show on dying in America. And it was a 6-hour series. He invited me and many other people back to a conference to train his staff, these kind of hard-nosed journalists who had just come back from South Africa, and to look at dying in America. It was called On Our Own Terms, this particular series. And so I prepared a very salient talk. I was going to be there with a lot of other silver-tongued devils, And so I wanted to give a good talk. I'm on this panel with these other well-known people, and they ate up all the time. There was no more time to give my salient talk. And Bill pulled me aside and he said, could you just speak to the heart of this matter in a really simple way? It's interesting that on the airplane, I had been thinking about the people that I worked with, these folks I talked about and lived on the streets, and what they'd shown me, what they'd taught me. And on this cocktail napkin, I'd written down 5 slogans, if you will, 5 phrases. It turns out they are still what I'm calling the 5 invitations. The first one is don't wait. The second one is welcome everything, push away nothing. The third is bring your whole self to the experience. The fourth is find a place of rest in the middle of things. And the fifth is cultivate don't know mind. And maybe we'll get a chance to talk about some of them. Anyway, and so I pulled out my cocktail napkin and I spoke to these 5 basic points, which have been guidelines for me in taking care of people at the end of their life. But it turns out they have a relevance for all of us in living a life of more meaning and purpose than, I think, happiness.
When I see someone, I'm looking at number 3 here, for example, bring whole self to the experience. Interesting how you phrase it there. If one is awake, if one is being honest, bring whole self to the experience. I mean, I'm already kind of like kicking myself in the rear end saying, well, I haven't been doing that as good as I could. The bottom line, I'm not bringing the whole self to the experience.
Yeah, few of us do. Few of us do bring our whole self. There's parts of ourselves we hide away or stash away for some other time. Most of us, when we were coming up as kids, learned that there were certain things that were acceptable to our parents or to the authorities in our life, and there were certain things that weren't. And we submerged or pushed below consciousness the things that were not so acceptable, and put forward a self-image. And most of us live into that self-image, and it's something that we're continually protecting and propping up and getting others to agree with, etc. And when I say bring your whole self, I mean everything, all of it. Even the undesirable aspects of yourself. I mean, for me, one of the things that's really I've found is that if I'm going to build an empathetic bridge to someone else's experience, I have to know something about that myself. Folks on the street taught me that. They didn't care beans about Buddhism or any kind of psychological jargon. I had to be real with them. So if I said I understand, when they were afraid, and I said I understand, and I hadn't really looked at my own fear, then they would know I was just guessing, and they would sniff out my sentimentality and my insincerity. And so to be real with them, I had to do my homework. I had to look and see, what's my relationship to everything? And not just a few things, everything. My fear, my joy, my ambition, all of it, so that I could bring it all forward. To bring your whole self doesn't mean that you're perfect. It means no part of you is left out.
I was in San Francisco for the first time in probably over 15 years last fall. I really appreciate what you're saying, and I'll tell you why, because I walked by many of the people that you're describing. And my first feeling, I can say this is probably out of fear, my first feeling would not be to reach down, because I remember walking one particular block, and I was with a friend who had never been to America, but I walked one particular block with her. As an American, I was observing, I don't know how many different things I observed in that one block that I did not want to be on that block any longer. But you reach right down and embrace and get into that. But I have to say, as someone who's not used to it, you see it, the first reaction is most likely fear. That probably would have been my reaction.
Yeah, I think it is for most people too, and it certainly was for me at different times too. It's just that, there's a whole human being there, even if they're in a kind of distressing disguise, you know what I mean? The disguise of being a homeless person. There's a whole human being there. They weren't born like that, they weren't born confused. They weren't born isolated on the edges of the culture. that happened through sets of conditions in their life. Yeah. So what I found is if you just turn toward this person and meet them in a real way, I mean, sometimes people have all kinds of issues. They have mental health issues. They have addiction issues. And those things can certainly cloud their capacity to have a conversation with you. There's a whole human being there, and that's what we have to really, I think that's one of the things we have to see. And then when we recognize ourselves in them, because we're going to recognize our common humanity, then the way in which we treat them, the way in which we interact with them changes fundamentally. Because it's not the homeless guy anymore. It's not the person, the liver in room 402, in the hospital. It's a real person, with feelings and relationships and a life that matters to them. I think our work is really to find that in each other, actually. Yes, it's true that at the end of life, people have a little fewer defenses, oftentimes. They're more stripped away by the dying process, and so there's more access. That can be, as I've said several times now, a really honest time. But we can have it at any point in our lives. We have to be willing to. I mean, I think one of the most beautiful human qualities that we so undervalue is our vulnerability. The fact that our consciousness, if you will, can be porous to the world, can take in the world, that the world's beauty and sublime beauty, actually, and its horror, can impress itself on our consciousness, on our soul, so to speak. We can then feel into that experience and feel into the experience of others. And I think, in my case, I think it causes us to become a bit more compassionate with each other when we know that we're all in a boat together.
And again, so many of these experiences that you've had and reducing these invitations to a common way that we can all apply to our own lives. That's the secret of what you've done with your work here. I'm looking at number 4. It's reminding me of my 5-year yoga practice so far. Find a place of rest in the middle of things. I think this would be all of my yoga teachers that have got on me about my bad breath and not utilizing my breath as well as I can. But in the middle of those breaths that we all take every day, there's something in the middle, isn't there?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I mean, we often think of rest as something we're going to do later again, like when we get our list checked off or our work is done or when we go on a holiday. But I don't know about you, but my list is never checked off, So if I wait for that, I'm never going to rest. So I have to find a way of resting right in the middle of activity. And maybe that's what your yoga teachers are doing. I hope they weren't just talking about you having bad smelling breath. They were suggesting that you should use the breath as a way to connect with this.
Absolutely.
There's a story I like to tell. This woman, this old Russian Jewish lady, her name was Adele, and she was 86 years old and cantankerous, really. And she was at the Zen Hospice, and she was dying. And they called me, and so I came in to be with her, as I often did. I walked in the room, and there was a home health aide, a nurse's assistant, sitting on the bed with her. And I sat down in the corner. And I watched that Adele was breathing with great difficulty, this despite all the right medical interventions. There's a labor to dying, like there's a labor to getting born. And so this very well-meaning home health aide was next to her, and she said, Adele, you don't have to be frightened. We're right here with you. Adele looked at her straight in the eye and said, honey, if this was happening to you, you'd be frightened. Like that, right? So I stayed in the corner. And then a little bit later, Adele said, the very nice home health aide said to her, you look a little cold. Would you like a blanket or a shawl around your shoulders or something? And Adele said, of course I'm cold. I'm almost dead. and I thought, wow, I hope I have half the tenacity of this woman when I'm dying, But I saw a couple of things. One is, as I mentioned earlier, she was struggling with the breath, just despite her having oxygen and the right medications, etc. But there's a struggle. And the second was she didn't want any nonsense. She didn't want to talk about tunnels of light or some, spiritual bypass thing. I went up and I sat directly in front of her and I said, Adele, would you like to struggle a little bit less? Now, that's a real question. She said, yes. I said, okay then. I said, I noticed right there at the end of your breath, just before the next inhale, there was this little gap, this little pause. I wonder what it would be like if you could put your attention there for just a few moments. I'll do it with you. I didn't lead her. I just breathed with her. When she would breathe in, I would breathe in. When she would breathe out, I would breathe out. And I noticed that as she was doing this, the fear that was in her face started to drain away as she placed her attention on this gap, this little nanosecond between the exhale and the inhale. And then she said, I'm going to lay down now. And she laid back down on her pillow. And a few minutes later, she died very peacefully. I think Adele found the place of rest in the middle of things. Do you see? All the conditions were still the same. She was still dying. There was still shortness of breath. All the conditions hadn't been shifted. But what she did was find a place of resting right in the middle of them. And that's something I think we can all learn to do. And she found it in the breath, but where do each of us find it? Do we find it just by stopping and looking up, or the way we cross a threshold, or the way we wash our hands, There's 1,000 things that we do in every day that we could, in a way, ritualize or make a ritual out of the simple gestures of our life.
Could eliminate the need for sleeping pills if one could have that mastery.
Well, I think that we may more heavily rely on them than we might need to. Yeah. But I think it's not about it's a rest that's like resting right where you are. You know what I mean? Not as a prize for having gotten all your work done. I mean, we know, right? We know that this whole business of multitasking that we've been sort of sold a bill of goods here, that we don't really multitask. We do little things with little bits of attention, a lot of things with a little bit of attention. But what we find is that when people settle down and they do one task fully and completely, they actually get it done, and they're not exhausted, and then come to the next task and get it done and move along. So it's just that we're often scattering all of our energy. We're always all over the place. It's hard to be a calm presence when that's what's going on in our lives.
Let me go into that fifth invitation, because I really love the phrasing of it. And if you want to kind of go to the origins of that too, I know it goes back quite a bit of time into history, but cultivate the don't know mind. The don't know mind. I mean, that's not like a phrase that anyone outside of perhaps Zen Buddhist circles really uses, but the don't know mind. I mean, I've never flipped on any news channel or seen it in the Washington Post or anything, the don't know mind. It almost sounds like, it's like bad English, but it sounds beautiful when you think about it.
Yeah, I think it is beautiful. And, I sort of felt obliged to put something Zen-like in the list, I mean, Zen is full of these kinds of paradoxes, these kind of koans, we could say, that are really confusing when we first read them. I remember my son reading that when he was much younger, a teenager, and he thought, Dad, what the hell does that mean? A don't know mind isn't a mind of, we're not trying to generate stupidity here or ignorance. It's not an encouragement to avoid knowledge or learning. It's actually a mind that's really characterized by curiosity and surprise and awe, wonder, creativity, receptivity. Yeah, it's ready. It's a ready mind. It's a mind that's really ready to show up with whatever greets us. To have a don't know mind, it means not to impose all of our knowing on the situation. That happens so often where we take the present moment and we clobber it with our knowing from the past. And then we get results that are kind of similar to what we had in the past, and big surprise, right? So a don't know mind is a mind that's more fresh, more alive. And yes, it has its history that goes way back into, Buddhism, but particularly to Zen Buddhism, particularly the Buddhism that came out of China and Japan, It was a kind of encouragement for people not to throw away their knowledge, but to live in a way that was present, receptive, ready. So like when I go into a room where someone is dying, I mean, like I said to you, I've been with thousands of people as they die, but I've never been with this person before. So when I go into his or her room, I have to listen. I have to really pay attention to see what do they need. This is their dying. This is not my dying, and it's not the last person's dying. This is their dying.
You have to pay attention, though, too, because you, and I say this a little selfishly, you want to learn each time.
Sure, absolutely. And I also want to serve. I want to serve that person. I have this really stupid thing that I do, Michael. When I cross a threshold and go into a room where someone's dying, and I do it all the time, I look and see where the door hinges are. And if the door hinges are on the right, I step in with my right foot. And if the door hinges are on the left, I step in with my left foot. Now, this could be considered obsessive compulsive disorder or mindfulness. You choose. I prefer to think of it as mindfulness. And it's just a way of like reminding myself, I'm crossing a threshold. You're going into another world. You're going to be with this person. It's not like what you were in just a moment ago. Get it? It's a liminal space. It's an in-between space when you cross that threshold. And then you show up in the other room. You show up as best you possibly can. So don't know mind is that kind of alive, waking up mind. A few years ago, I had a heart attack. I was teaching a program for docs and nurses on compassion, and in the middle of it, I had a heart attack. Anyway, it resulted in a triple bypass surgery, an urgent one. And my son, who was an adult, about 29 at the time, he and I were having this heart-to-heart conversation. And in the middle of it, he said, "Dad, are you going to live through this?" Now, I'm a dad, I'm a father. Of course, I want to reassure my son. But I said to him, out of my mouth, I heard myself say, "I'm not taking sides." And it really shocked me, Michael. It really surprised me. I wasn't trying to be sage or Buddhist or any of those things. It was just true. I wasn't taking sides between life and death. And so it wasn't that one was better than the other. I just saw that I had a view, I had a relationship which was characterized by equanimity, which is really a flavor of love, actually, equanimity. It's a balanced love in a way. And fortunately, I did the surgery and everything came out great. And here I am talking to you. But it helped me to have that kind of balanced view. And what happened with my son, which was really interesting in that moment, was that he was a little shocked when I said that, as was I, actually. But it was so true that we both relaxed. And that often is the case, that when what's true is in the room, everybody relaxes.
When you're in an anxiety moment, whatever it might be for anyone's life, and then there's that trigger, that release, that relax, it's the best feeling.
Right, because we feel in a kind of alignment, or, there's lots of other words that we could use, but it's true. And the more we are willing to move toward what's true, and nobody's got the corner market on what's true, no religion, no anybody. It's just what's true in this moment. And when we face that, then more truth reveals itself, we could say, or shows itself. And that's, my life is about the love of discovering truth. And it's not like there's one big one out there. It's constantly unfolded, constantly showing itself. For me, that's the motivation for my work, for my own spiritual practice, my relationships, everything. How can I discover what's true right now?
Frank, you're on a hell of a journey. Really interesting experiences. I'm sure if you allowed me, and I think you could tell, that I would find a way to pick your mind for hours and just keep probing to get deeper and deeper into the experiences and to keep pulling them out. I enjoy this kind of thing in the interview process. I enjoy kind of getting inside someone's mind, because you can't even write questions down for these kinds of things. You just kind of have to start exploring and noodle and see, okay, I don't know Frank, but what's going on in his mind? Let's pull some pieces out. Let's elaborate here. Let's carve off a little bit there. That's how it goes.
And you do a lot of work around trends, right? This trend has been really steady. People get born and they die, 100%. It's been like this for forever. Why not step into that truth? Why not just get that and not hide from it in the shadows, but really say, this is true. Now how should I live? Knowing the cup is already broken, you take good care of it. One day it's going to fall off the shelf. So you enjoy it and you have your tea or your coffee in it, whatever it is, and you really enjoy the cup, and that's our life.
The book, everyone should check it out. The 5 Invitations, Discovering What Death Can Teach Us About Living Fully. It's been all the rage for many years now. There's been quite a few books on Stoicism and whatnot. And I think there's a lot of value, a lot of kind of, I'm not going to say similar is not the right word, but it's in the same kind of headspace, the same kind of try and be present, try and be in the moment. You are being right now. And that type of thinking is just so smart for the modern world.
Yeah, and it's, as you say, it's not a new thing, Stoicism has been talking about this forever, right? The Greeks and the Romans were talking about it a long time ago. But, it has an application to our everyday life. Dying is not predominantly a medical event. It's much more an event of relationships, our relationship to ourselves, to those we love, to however we hold the ultimate kindness in the universe. This book isn't about how do you take care of dying people. It's about what do you learn there at that precipice of death that really has meaning and value for us for the rest of our lives.
The best place for people to go, they can go to Amazon and buy the book. You also run the Metta Institute. Is there a best website? Is that the best place for people to go?
They can go to Metta, www.mettainstitute.org, and Metta is METTA, 2 T's. Or they can go to 5invitations.com, and they can find my schedule there, things I'm doing, And also there's a lot of resources there about, how do you live more fully, and what do you do if you're grieving, or what about if you're a healthcare provider and you're trying to stay balanced in a really difficult environment. So there's lots of free services there and free materials that people can take up. 5invitations.com.
You've picked a topic, Frank, that no one can ignore because everyone has to deal with it.
Yeah, that's the greatest teacher.
Frank, I appreciate you taking the time today.
You're very welcome. Nice to be with you. Thanks for making the time.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.